Hello there and welcome to the next 𝗠𝗏𝗞𝗘 section, which is the section on the sample meals. And once more, I did a sketch for this section before actually building it and designing it as well. And so I want this section to look a little bit like this. So first, we are going to have two card components here and one for each of the meals that was provided to us in the initial content. So these meal cards are going to be a bit inspired by these two examples that are here on the right side. So basically having a photo or an image at the top, then the name of the meal, and then below that there's going to be the data about the meal. And so for each of the data points, I also want to include an icon there. So this is going to be the first time we will use some icons in this project, and so that's going to be fun as well. And yeah, so we have here these two cards, as I just mentioned. And then besides that, we're going to include the list of diets that are compatible with the 𝗠𝗏𝗞𝗘 application. So here, again, we're going to use our grid, and we will have 3 columns, just as we see here. Okay, so does that sound good? Well, then let's get started building this. And as always, let's start by adding a new section right after the previous one. So a new section element, and this one I'm going to call it the section meals. Okay, and then just like before, we also want that same subheading and also the heading itself. So basically just this here. So we can just copy this entire, let's call it a component, and then paste that here. Okay, and I think that in our content, we actually already have the title for this meals section, and so that's this one. So let's just copy that, and yeah, put that here. And this section here could be called sample meals, so this, but actually I prefer to simply call it meals. So quick and short, that makes it very easy to understand what this section is all about. Okay, so that was easy, but now let's create basically our next container here, because of course we also want the next piece of content to be centered. And as I just mentioned during the sketch, we also want this to be a grid with 3 columns, right? And so we use our reusable grid here, and we use that grid class, which has the 3 columns. So which we also set up in one of the previous lectures where we created this reusable grid. Remember that? And so here, let's now create the 2 meal cards and then that list. So meal, and let's copy this again using the Option or Alt-Shift down shortcut. And actually once again, so that here we just have to replace this with a list, let's say. So this is going to be the list of diets. So I'm just writing this here right now, just so we can see it in the website, the web page. Okay, so let's see. And indeed, there we go. So we have our 3 columns here side by side already. And so now let's start by filling them up. All right, so basically just designing and building here the very first card so that we can then copy it here into the second column. But first of all, let's actually add some padding to this section so that we can actually see what's going on. So I'm gonna copy all of this, even that CSS code there. So meals section, and then the section meals, because the padding might be exactly the same as before, so that we maintain the same consistency. Okay. And so now we have some good spacing between these sections and can now start building our very first card component right here. Okay, so remember the first thing that we want in this card is the image. Right, so image source, and then as always, it is inside of our image folder, then slash, and then down here you see we have a folder with meals. And so first let's use meal 1. So let's call it the meal image. And we also need to give it some alt text. So let's actually check out what this first recipe is all about. So this one is called 𝗦𝗣𝗜𝗖𝗬 or something like that. So let's actually just use this as the alt text here. Okay, so that's the image. And then we want the meal name. So for that, I'm going to use a paragraph, and again, not a heading element, because, well, this is not really a new subsection of this section, I would say. So just a generic paragraph is more than enough here. So calling this one meal title could have been meal name as well. And so again, using 𝗦𝗣𝗜𝗖𝗬 or something like that here. And then now we want to basically put these pieces of data. So let me copy all of it here so we have it handy. Okay, and so this kind of looks like a list, right? And so let's actually use an unordered list to mark up this content. So meal, let's say attributes. And then, as you already know, a list item for each of them. Now, when we have some pieces of data like these here to display, it looks kind of, well, let's say bad to just display it like this. So like writing what it is, and then like a colon, and then the actual value. So it's always better to try to put this content into some kind of short sentence. For example, saying 650 calories instead of saying number of calories and then colon 650. Okay, so this is a lot better like this. Now, as I said also before, here we are actually going to want some icon, but let's leave that for a bit later and first put our actual data here. All right. Now here actually let's give it a class as well. So let's call it meal attribute. So here we have the attributes, which is the list, and then each of them is a single attribute. Okay, and now I'm again duplicating this line a couple of times. So we have 650 calories. Then here we have this category of vegetarian. And remember how I mentioned way back in the component gallery lecture that categories are many times a good fit for using tags, right? And so here I'm actually going to add like a tag before this meal title here with vegetarian. And that's going to be even better here in the next one, because here we actually have two categories. And so then we can add two tags with vegan and paleo, and that will then make it visually very easy to understand exactly what category this recipe is in. And it's also visually a bit more interesting than having a huge list. Right? So actually let's immediately do that. Put that right here. So for that, let me use a span element, because we might want to have multiple of them side by side. And also it's just like a single word. And so I think a generic span element is just fine. And so let me actually call it just tag, because we might want to reuse it at some other point in the page. So it is vegetarian. Okay. And so with that, we have these two done. Next, we have this thing, which is the Nutri-Score. And here they tell us it is registered. And so we need that small r symbol. So I think you know what I mean. So that's the registered symbol. And for that, there is yet another HTML entity, which is the reg. And if we hover over it, yeah, there you can see it up there. Okay, so the Nutri-score, and this is something that I made up, but let's just say that it's 74 here. And then we have the average rating. Okay, but there's no need to tell the user that this is an average. This is kind of obvious. And so let's say 4.9 rating. Okay, and then it's quite common to simply add the number of reviews or ratings between parentheses here. So no need to add a fourth row with that data. So these are kind of related, and so we're putting them all in the same row there. Okay, so this is our first draft of this card component. And if we need to add some more stuff, we can do that later. But as for the content, it's already all here. So let's quickly check it out here on the page. And as always, the first thing that we need to fix immediately is this huge image, because it actually makes a column here way bigger than it should actually be. So let's do that here. And it is called meal image. And so, as always, we want a width of 100%. And so immediately that is a lot better. All right, and now let's just quickly format this text content there. So that's the meal title. Let's give it a font size of 2 rem to start with. We also want the same dark color that we have been using for these kind of headings. Then a font weight of 600 also. And for now that looks good, I think, at least. And now let's style here the meal attribute. So not yet the, well, actually we can style both. So the meal attributes, which is the list, so that we can get rid of the bullet points, which is to say list style none. And then the individual ones, let's give them a font size of 1.8 rem. So probably these two here are not going to be enough, but let's just check that out. Yeah, this could be a little bit bigger. And of course, we want some spacing after it as well. So the next step should be 2.4 and margin to the bottom of 3.2 rem, which again, you could of course experiment with a little bit before arriving at that value. So that looks huge right now, but it will look okay once we also start adding some space between these lines here. And so let's actually do that. And in fact, I will do that again using Flexbox and the gap property. Okay, so instead of using margin to the bottom and then having to remove it in the last element, I will use Flexbox and changing the flex direction to column. So do you remember that? So I will just write it here now. And then just in case you don't remember what flex direction does, I will show you that slide again, maybe in case you skipped that lecture previously. So again, I will set the parent container of all these list elements between which I want some space to a flex container. So flex, right? But now they will be side by side by default, right? And so that's because, of course, by default, the flex direction is set to row, right? But we can change that. So we can set it to column. And so now it is, well, the other way around. So you see here now that these flex items are one after another. And so now when we apply the gap property, the gap will also no longer be applied horizontally, but vertically. And so let's do that. Let's say to rem, and that looks just fine. Okay. And just to make this crystal clear, because it is actually a very important part of Flexbox, I'm again showing you that animation where we switch from the beginning, which is what we have right here, to adding flex direction column. And so this again is the default, which is flex direction set to row. But then once we set it to column, it will look like this. Okay. And so the main axis now rotated 90 degrees, and the same thing for the cross axis. And so in this situation, the align items property will now align the items horizontally and not vertically, and also justify content does now align the items vertically. Okay. And finally, the gap property now acts a bit like the margin bottom property and no longer like the margin right. So basically, it applies the spacing now vertically and not horizontally. Okay, and now just to finish this first part, let's quickly add the icons here. So we want an icon for the calories, for the Nutri-Score, and also for the rating. Now we already used some icons before in the previous section, and those were the hero icons, right? Remember that? And with those icons, what we did was to simply copy the SVG code right into our HTML code, right? Now the problem with that approach is that it clutters up our HTML code a lot, and especially if we use a lot of icons. So at some point, it starts making our code a lot harder to understand than it should be. And so now we're actually going to use another type of icon. And so let me show that to you. So yeah, so remember we used to use the hero icons. So just in case you didn't watch the previous lectures, maybe. So here we would then simply copy the SVG and paste it. But now we're going to use an icon pack called ion icons. Okay, so these are the icons, so what they look like, and they are really nice and round, and I really like this icon pack for the way it looks like and how it integrates with many different design personalities. Now up here we have this usage link where we can basically read how we can use these icons. And what we want to do is this very basic usage. So for this usage, we need to copy this script here. So this is basically some JavaScript that we will integrate into our own page. And what this script will do is it will give us access to a special element called ion icon, right? And then there we simply can use the name with the icon that we want to use. And so that will then basically automatically inject the SVG into our page. And that probably sounds too complicated than it needs to be, but I just wanted to explain you how it works behind the scenes. So hopefully you copied that as well, and then just pasting it here right before this closing body tag. Okay. Now, if for some reason this page here looks very different by the time you're watching this video, and somehow you cannot find this script, and so this line of code here, you can simply pause the video now for a minute and type out this piece of code. Okay, so type it and paste it there at the end of the HTML exactly where I put it. Okay, and then we can simply come here to the icons, and then we can choose one that we like, let's say this one, and then all we have to do is to copy this code and paste it into our own code. Okay, so the first icon that we want is for calories, so that's some kind of energy, so I think like fire makes sense there, or a flame maybe, so I like this one here better. And so here we could actually also download the SVG, but again, we are actually interested in this. So we just need to click here, then it will automatically copy it. And then I just paste it right here. Okay, give it a save. And then right next to this element here, so this icon element here is of course not a standard HTML element. It is simply, as I just said before, basically created by this script that we passed into our page here. Okay, and so this then creates this custom HTML element which will hold our icon. Now, when we have an element containing something, then usually I like to have the text that is besides it also wrapped in some other element. So let's use a span element simply for that, right here. Just like this. And so this then makes it easier for us to, for example, align these two using Flexbox a bit later. Okay? So let's see how it looks like in our code. And to do this, I think we will have to manually reload now. Well, that didn't really work somehow. Let's see if our script is here. Yep, it is right here. But let's see here on our console. Oh, we see that there was some kind of error here for some reason. So let's maybe try to quit this here. So the live server, and then try it again. So go live again. And then let me reload that page here. And we still got the same error here, but actually off camera, I discovered that we need to use another version here. So basically, we right now are using 5.5.1, but we want to use 5.4.0, which is the version that I actually used previously. Okay, so if we give it a save now, then you see that the icon is actually here. And so even if it did work in your case, please make sure to also use version 5.4.0. All right. Now here we get this warning, which says that we should actually also use this script here. So if you also got this warning, then just go ahead and copy this and paste that right below this first one. All right. But if you didn't get this warning, then never mind. This is not something really important. Oh, and actually I didn't do as they tell us to do here. So instead, we should actually put this in the head. So let's grab these two here, copy them. Okay. Remove this from here. And put it right in the head. So put that here after the CSS. So you see that working with some third-party libraries like this actually is can sometimes take a little bit of time and be a bit difficult, but in the end, we can manage to do it, right? And again, if those errors didn't occur in your case, then you can just pause the video and write exactly what I have here. And just make sure to use these same version numbers. Okay, and so now everything is working. This script is doing its magic and it is injecting basically this flame icon into our code. And if we inspect this element, we can actually see that. So you see that this iron icon is now here. And then in there we have this strange thing, which is the shadow root. And then this is where the SVG lives. And so you see this looks a little bit similar to the SVG that we manually copied before. Right? But anyway, let's now just quickly take our remaining two icons so that we can then start styling this card. So here let's use like a fork or something. Well, maybe it's called cutlery. or maybe it's called food or eating. So sometimes we need to try a little bit until we find what we're looking for. So in this case, it's actually restaurant. Or if we don't want to search, we can of course also just manually go through these icons, which is actually what I did before this lecture. So to make it a bit faster to find it now. Okay. And again, let's then wrap the rest of the content here into a small span element. And then finally, the rating is usually associated with stars. And so let's use this one here. Just copy it, place that right there. Then it's annoying that it immediately creates the closing one that we don't want right there. But yeah. So with this, we should be good to go. We can close this one, but let's leave the rest of these tools here open as we keep needing them as we build the project. Okay, so we have our very basic card here. It still doesn't have a lot of formatting, and so let's take care of that in the next lecture. Let's now continue the work on our meals section. So it's time now to format these lines here a little bit better. So making these icons here maybe orange and adding some space here. And probably also making them a little bit bigger. So right now we don't have any class name here yet, but of course we can add a class to these iron icons just like on any other element. So this is the meal icon. So let's add that here. And here we can format it just like before with height and width. So let's use 2.4 rem and a width of 2.4. And these two should be the same because usually these icons are drawn in a rectangular box. Now here I'm not sure if we should set the stroke or the fill. So let's just start with this one and setting it to our color. And while the stroke did not really change, let's try fill. And that also doesn't work. And so let's also try color. And so that does the trick. So these icons here apparently are treated a bit as if they were text. And so this is another one that we should experiment with when we want to style icons like this. So each of these icon packs does in fact work a little bit differently. And so we always need to experiment with which of the properties we can style them. So especially with the color. Okay. Sometimes we even need to use font size to style them in terms of the size. And that would actually also work here. So if I turned off these, I could use font size of 2.4 rem, and that would then make them just as big as they are now with height and width. Okay, so whenever you need to style icons, you need to experiment with all of these. But anyway, the one that worked was color, and so now let's vertically align the text with the icon and also add some spacing. And so that again is a perfect use case for Flexbox, right? And the flex container of the icon and the text is of course the meal attribute. So the list icons, right? So display, flex, then align items to align them vertically, center, and then let's add some gap property here. Let's say 1.6 rem. Okay. So that's starting to look quite nicer. Now here, let's make this a bit more interesting and add some visual hierarchy by giving these values here some more font width. So these 3 numbers. So I'm simply going to wrap them into a strong element. So strong, and let's actually type the number here again and delete this one. Just like this. Oh, and here the value disappeared. I think it was 74. And then here the same. Okay. However, strong probably looks a bit too strong, right? So I think that doesn't look so nice because the font width here is way too bold. So let's take it down a little bit. And let's actually do that by default whenever we use the strong tag. And this is something that I do all the time, which is to basically just redefine the strong element to make it with just a font weight of 500 instead of 700, which is probably the default. Okay, so of course that goes into the general and not the style CSS, which is just for the individual sections and components. And so that looks a lot better actually. Next up, let's format this tag here. So that doesn't look quite nice yet. And so where is that? Ah, it's right here with the tag class. So I like to follow the same order as the elements appear in HTML. So let's first set it to an inline block so that we can apply some paddings to it. So probably some very small padding. And actually that's in the other file. So let's see what we have for small values. So we have 2, 4, 8. So let's maybe experiment with 4 and 8 pixels. So 4 pixels, or actually 0.4 rem and 0.8 rem on the sides. Let's also decrease the font size to 1.2. Make the text uppercase. So text transform uppercase. And so these are all like the typical formattings of the tag element. So like a small tag component. And of course, we also need some background color. Now this is vegetarian. And so I would say we need some green color there. So actually, let's get that here from open color. So let's just click on green here and maybe this one. So this is nice and light. So let's try that. So background color like this. And since we're at it, let's make also the text color darker, because on a background color, usually we need some darker text. All right, so looking good already. We just need to give it some spacing, and I also want to make the borders round. So that's really one of the defining characteristics of tags, usually. Now, as for the spacing, remember how I said in the beginning that for the next meal, we will actually have 2 categories. So 2 tags, and so we should probably wrap those 2 inside of some parent element, onto which we will then add some margin bottom. Okay, but first let's add that border radius. And here, remember how we cannot use 50% because that will make it look like this. But instead, we just use some very large value. It doesn't matter. We can even use pixels because this value is just arbitrary. So now it has the shape that we want. Okay, let's just wrap it into a div now with the class of meal tags. And so this meal tags will then have some margin. maybe 12 pixels. And yeah, that looks nice, except that now, of course, we also need some spacing inside. But so first, let's now style the card itself, like to make it actually look like a card. Now, there are multiple ways in which we can do that. For example, giving it some background color, but usually I like to keep the cards white. Now, since we're also on a white background here, a nice effect that we can use is to give it a very subtle shadow. And so that shadow will then distinguish the card element from the rest of the page. So from outside of the section. Okay, so let me demonstrate that to you. And so now I actually need to select the meal, which we hadn't done yet. So remember, that is box shadow. Then here, horizontally, as always, we want no shadow, but only vertically. So let's use one of our values, which is 24 pixels. And then as for the blur, I like to use double. So 48 pixels, or actually rem, and here the same. All right. And then, as always, we use the RGBA when we want some transparency. So make it black by giving it 0, and then here some other value, like 0.1 for 10%. So let's check it out. And looking nice. Maybe a little bit too dark, so we can make it a little bit less visible. So let's put it at 0.75. So that's 7.5% basically. And yeah, that looks a bit more subtle, and I like that. But the corners here are, of course, a little bit harsh, so let's also round them. So let's again use our border radius of 9 pixels that we have been using. Right. But we could actually use a little bit more. So let's try like 12 pixel here, because this component is a lot bigger, and so then we also need more border radius. All right. Now here actually I like odd numbers, that's why I chose 9 as well. And so here let's use 11, and I will put that here also in our design decisions. Okay. And so yeah, there's just one thing to fix, which you maybe have noticed. And well, if you didn't, let me show you. So you see that here we have the rounded corners, and here where we don't have the image, we can also slightly see them here on the top. But then here we have that image. And so that image is basically lying now on top of the rounded corners. So the roundness is here in the background, but we cannot see it because the image is laying on top of that. So it's basically overflowing this element now. But we can easily fix that by saying that we want that overflow. So basically whatever overflows this container should be hidden. So I think this one we hadn't used before. And so this is another very, very important property. Maybe we have used it actually in the previous project where we did that share website. But well, if I hadn't talked about it, then yeah, this is an important one, and that fixes it, right? And you see that also here, the M is kind of cut off because it was actually also going out here of this corner. Okay, next up, let's add some padding here. So of course, this cannot be glued to the sides like it is right now. So let's add some padding. And now, where should we actually add that padding? So should we do it right here in the meal? So padding, let's say 4.8 rem. That's not really what we're going to want, right? Because then that padding also wraps outside of the image, right? So it's now outside this entire meal element. And so that's of course not what we want. So whenever we are designing a card like this, where we have an image at the top, we then need another box which contains basically the rest of the written content. And so let's do that here. So basically placing all the other content inside of another box, which let's simply call it the meal content. Okay, let's cut this here and paste it here at the very end. Give it a save. And now, of course, we want that padding inside of that meal content alone. So let's move it down there. And beautiful. That looks just a lot better. So the spacing here looks actually right, I think, except maybe here for the top. So here I think we have a bit too much. So let's reduce that. So we can say 3.2 rem at the top, and then 4.8 on the right, and all the other sides. Or alternatively, we could also have left it the way it was, and then adding a padding top property and set that one to 3.2. So that's exactly the same thing, and now it looks a lot better. Let's actually just make this here bold. I'm noticing that we were kind of missing that. So font weight, let's say 600, in order not to make it too bold. And yeah, I think with this, we designed a really, really nice looking card, which has all the data that we want, and it also has some nice visual hierarchy. So these two pieces of content, I think they are more related to one another, and so they have a bit less spacing. Then here we have a lot more spacing between kind of this introduction and the data part. And then of course, between each of the data points, we of course also have a little bit of spacing, but not as much spacing as here, right? Then we also increased the visual hierarchy by making these values bold. And so the attention immediately jumps to those now. And yeah, again, I think this looks quite nice. And so what we can do now is to simply copy all of this HTML here and create our second card based on that. So let's do that. So grabbing this meal, all of this, and replace what we already had. And just to make sure we copied that correctly, let's see. And indeed, there it is. Great. So let's start replacing the content. So here it is now meal number 2. And we need to make sure that these images have the exact same dimensions, or at least the exact same aspect ratio, because otherwise then these two images here will look very awkward. So if they didn't have the same height. So if this one, for example, started only here, then all of that content here would also be shifted up, and that would then look very bad. So if you have 2 cards or more with images in the top, make sure that they do have the exact same aspect ratio or the same dimensions. Okay. But anyway, let's grab now the data for this one. And now this should be very, very simple. Just pasting it down here. So calories, we have now 400. We have a Nutri-score of 92. So this one is probably healthier, which is because it is a salad, I guess. So actually, I forgot to copy the name of it. So it's the avocado salad. So we need to replace that here and also in the alt text of the image. All right, and now finally the categories. So this one is vegan. And let's just duplicate this line here and also paleo or paleo or whatever. Okay, and let's see. Yeah, beautiful. Now we should probably just change the background color of these two so that basically each of the categories has a different background color. All right, so in our code, we should not have the background color right here in the tag, but instead create, just like many times before, like a variation. So I'm writing tag, then dash dash for basically a modification, which is, again, a standard that I like to use. And then the first one is for vegetarian, which has this background color. So Alt or Option down key to move it here. And then let's simply duplicate this 2 times, one for vegan and one for paleo. Then let's add those here. So this is the tag vegetarian. And where are the other? Yeah. So tag vegan and tag paleo. And now let's find 2 other colors for these. So vegan should also be green. So let's maybe go with this one. Okay. And then let's just use yellow for the other one. So maybe this one or this one. That other one looks a bit too orange. But of course, you can experiment around with that as you'd like. And beautiful. Very nice. Let's just quickly add some spacing here. And that's very simple as well, right? So meal tags, let's make it a flex container. And then simply add a gap of like just 4 pixels, like 0.4 rem. So small detail, but that does look better than before. Nice. So that's very beautiful, really nice looking cards here side by side. And so all that's left to do now is to create this list of diets. And I'm leaving that for the next lecture so that we can now take just another quick break here. All right, now in part 3 of building the meals section, let's quickly build our diet list and also work on some other smaller details. But before we do any of that, I actually noticed that we have a small bug here in our code. So when we hover over this button here, notice that we have a weird effect here with this border. So especially when we move the mouse out. So watch how that kind of happens immediately, right? So the background color does fade out and in, but not the border. And so that's an error that we have in the hero section. Or actually that's not in the hero section, that's here in the general file where our button is. And the problem is that, here. So here in the button, we transition only the background color, but, well, not the shadow. So box shadow is what creates that border. So that's the trick that I showed you back here. And so right now, that box shadow property is not transitioned, but only the background color. And so we should not do this. So I'm duplicating it and then commenting this one. But instead, let's simply transition all properties. And so that's the reason why I always simply by default use all, because then a bug like that can never happen. So with bug, we mean mistakes in programming, right? And so now it looks a lot more fluid. And so just as expected. But anyway, moving back down here, let's now add our list here. So we already have that div element here. And so now let's simply create that unordered list here. And actually, this is the one that I want to call list. And this one, let's call it diets. Okay. And now each list item should have like an icon, for example, a check mark. And then besides that, it might have, or it will have then these list of diets. Right? So let's basically wrap each of them inside of an li. And well, that doesn't work so nice. So I'm just going to copy that everywhere. So using multiple cursors by hitting Alt or Option. And then again, it does these automatically. But then we can move here to the end of the line. And that's a lot better. Okay. So there is our list. Let's just actually add also a class to each of them here. So I'm again using multiple cursors by hitting the Option or Alt key. And then we can write in multiple places at the same time. So once more, a very, very handy trick that we can use in VS Code. Okay. And actually, I'm also going to need these multiple cursors because I now also want to insert the icon here. So for now, let's take a look. Yeah, and of course, nothing changed. So we just added the class. But now, yeah, it's quite typical for a list like this to use a check mark icon. So if I search for that here, then there is one for sure. So we actually have multiple options here. So we're using a lot of circles, so we could go with this one, but I think that this is a lot cleaner. So let's actually this one here. So check mark outline. And now I simply paste it everywhere, right? So it is everywhere, and then I want the rest of the content to be inside of a span element. So I can very simply do that. And then again, it created this. Oh, and now it doesn't work so well. So now let me just close that here and then copy that. So this looks like a mess now. So you need to be careful with where exactly you close your elements. So it's right after each of these words. But then once we have the automatic formatting coming from Prettier, it should look a lot clearer. And there we go. So each of the li has one ion icon element and one span element. And each of them has then the diet name. So I think this does look correct. Let's quickly check that out. And somehow it always goes back to the top now. And yeah, so there are our icons. And so let's now visually format all of this. And the first thing that we should do is to get rid of the bullet points there. So let's come down here. Now that's very simple. List style, none. Okay. Then let's also, of course, style the icons. Oh, and here I forgot to add another class. So again, I'm using multiple cursors here just to make it easier. And there are actually even better techniques, but that would be a bit too much here. So class and then list icon. Okay. So width, let's use 30 pixels, and then the height needs to be the same. And remember that here we actually need to use the color in order to style the color of this icon. Okay. Nice. So that's the icons. But now, of course, we need to make the text bigger. So let's do that here in list item. So font size, and I'm again using 1.8 rem which is kind of a standard that we use in many places. Right. And then we should vertically align all of this. Right, so the icon with the text. And so let's just make this here a flex container. Because once again, this list item here is the parent of this icon and of this span. So just what we also had here before in these list elements. So display flex align items of center. And let's of course also add some gap between the two. Okay, nice. So we have the spacing here. Now, of course, we need the spacing also between the elements. And so once again, I'm now using the trick of using flex direction column. So that's again very similar to what we did before. So display flex direction column. And then let's also use 1.6 rem for the gap. Okay, beautiful. So that's looking great. Let's just add a title here. Let's see if there is one in the content. And well, let's just use what they already have here. So 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗬 works with any diet. And then here, let's do that before this list, but of course still inside of this container. So this diets element, which is basically this column in the grid. So again, using the h3 with the heading tertiary class that we already created before. So I think that was the name. And if not, we can just fix that. Let's add a colon here. And nice. Now the 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗬 here is maybe a bit too much, because if we remove that and had just works with any diet, then that would fit probably just in one line, which would look a lot better. So works with any diet. Yeah, that's beautiful. And the spacing is also already nice, which is because this is the exact same element, or it has the exact same styling as this one. Okay, and so there lies the power of reusability across the page. Okay, so this looks good, but actually I want to add another thing. And that is just like a small link here in the end of this section, which can lead us to all recipes. So let's say that this here are like the sample meals, but that the user wanted to see what meals are actually available in 𝗦𝗜𝗜𝗖𝗬. And so then after these sample meals, there might be a link that will lead to a different page. So we will not build that page, of course, but we can still add a link here below. Okay. So we want to do that in the same section, but outside of this div here. So let's select that, because then it will select the one in the top so that we can see what's happening. So we want it to happen after this container, right? So after this grid. So let's simply add another div there and another container, because we also want this one to be centered in the viewport. So div class container. And let's also call this all recipes. So here all I'm going to do is to add a link that is not going to point anywhere. And I will add the class of link. So here what I want to do is to basically create a generic link element that we could once again reuse all over our page. So see all recipes. And then here I like to use that right arrow. So RARR. So that's an HTML entity that I use all the time. And so I already know it by heart. But on my resources page, there is a link to a page which contains a huge list of all the relevant HTML entities. All right. Now, of course, for now, that doesn't look great. So let's fix a couple of things starting actually with the spacing maybe. So how can we add spacing here? I mean, this element here, all of this is a container and a row, or actually a grid. So just as we saw before, but let's go back there. So we have container, grid, and grid 3 columns. And so to now add some margin here to the bottom, we would have to create another class for that margin, right? So we don't want to add any margin to any of these reusable classes here, right? Because we want them to be basically as neutral as possible. So we could add another helper class here. So a little bit like we did before. And actually, let's do that. So we did that here with one of the buttons. Yeah. So here the margin right small, because we had the same situation where we didn't want to add any margin to any of these button classes here. Again, because they should be reusable, right? So let's now do another helper class, which I'm going to call margin bottom, and let's call it MD for medium. And here I'm going to use 4.8 rem. And again, using the important keyword so that it really will apply. And so now if we add this class here, so yeah, so to this grid and this container here, then that will add that margin. Okay, and here it is, right? So hopefully that made sense and you understood why we did create that new special class here, right? Now we could have done it in another way also. For example, simply adding a margin top to all recipes right here, right? So that would also have been possible, but I liked to use the reusable way. So let's create the all recipes here, and let's center the text. And let's also give it a font size of, again, 1.8 rem. And I'm putting the font size here and not on the link. And I'm doing that for the same reasons as before. So that maybe I will want to reuse this link on other places in the page. And then I don't want to have it always with a font size of 1.8 rem. So somewhere else, maybe a better font size for a link will be 1.4 rem. And so then if we had this fixed size, we could not do that. And so by setting the font size here, then the link, so the anchor element, will simply inherit that size. And here it is, right? And now, of course, we need to style this to adapt it to the rest of the visual style of our page. And so let's do that right here. So after this button, maybe. So link, well, that should be first link, and then the visited pseudo class. And here the first thing that I want to do is to give it a brand orange color. Then I want to remove the text decoration, set it to none. But then I actually want to recreate something similar. So let's just see what we have right now. And so, of course, now there is no underlining, but usually links do have some underline, right? However, usually we do not use text decoration for that, but recreate it using a border, because, as I will show you, that looks a lot nicer. So let's do that. So border bottom, 1 pixel, solid, and then the color of the border. And now here, let me show you yet another trick. So instead of writing the exact same color as we have here, which is the color that we want, so instead of doing this, we can do something else, which is to write the current color keyword. And so what this will do is that it will take the color that is currently the text color. Okay, and so then we don't have to repeat the same color. And that is especially helpful if for some reason we change the color, for example, on a hover state. Okay, so for now it doesn't look so good yet, so that's okay. But what usually we do when we design a link is to then give it some padding at the bottom. So padding bottom and then something really small like 2 pixels. And if we want to use padding, we also need to set this to an inline block. Right. And so let's check that out. Now that looks kind of the same. So let's inspect that here. Well, that actually makes a difference. So these 2 pixels that we have here, and if we had the text decoration, it would be right here. So that does not look ideal. And so this is why everyone does it like this. So we remove the text decoration and then do it in this way. All right. And now as for the hover and active states, which, as you see, we usually always group together, but we wouldn't have to, of course. They could be different, and we did that in the very first project, but again, it's very common to see them being together. Okay, so here let's change the color simply to the darker color, which is this one. Okay, and then as we hover over it, watch how the border also changes to the same color, right? And so that's because we used the current color trick, so that keyword. And so now, yeah, it always automatically has the exact same color as the text, right? However, in this case, we actually don't want the underline anymore. So that's another common style that is common to use on links. So when we hover them, we remove the border at the bottom, right? However, we cannot just say border bottom none, for example, and let me show you why. So you see that the entire layout jumps a little bit by 1 pixel, right? And so that is because that 1 pixel is actually part of the element. And so when we remove that on hover, then the element becomes smaller, and then, well, that messes up the spacing of the entire page. And in this case, it is just 1 pixel, but still, it will create a noticeable effect, as you can see here, or maybe you can experiment it on your own computer. And so instead, what we do is to keep it at 1 pixel still, solid, but instead of giving it a real color, we use the transparent keyword. Okay, and so here you just learned another important keyword for colors. And so that will now fix that problem. Okay, now just to finish, let's make this animate here as well. And so on the normal state, we use the transition property with all and set it to, let's again use 0.3 seconds. Okay, so that looks very nice. And so now let's analyze our entire section here. So I think it looks really, really good, like professionally designed, but we can still improve just a small detail here. So right now, due to the fact that we have this link here centered, we can see some imbalance here. So all of this looks a bit centered here as well, and then also the link, but then we have this here aligned to the left side, right? So it's aligned to the left, just like here as well. And so to make this one a bit different from the first one, and also to add some balance to this section, we can also center all of this. And as you will see, this will then create a really nice effect. So making it a little bit different than the other section. All right. So to center that text, we have to come here to where it is defined. So that's right here. Now, how can we actually center this text here? So, of course, we do not want to add text align center on these two, right? And once again, that is because these are supposed to be reusable. So instead, we can simply center, we can simply set the text align center property on the container here, right? And so that's exactly what I will do. And I will create another helper class here. So let me actually write that here. So helper classes, or we can also call them like settings classes. So these are small helper classes that have just one declaration. So I'm calling this one here, let's call it center text, and then text align center. And so now I can simply add that here. So center text, and then these two elements will actually inherit that, right? We could also put it directly here and here. Well, here actually I think it would not work because this is an inline element unless we change that. Let's see if we actually did. Oh yeah, we set it to a block. So we could actually also set center text here, but well, it's simpler to simply put it here and then have these two elements inherit it. Okay, and so once again, we created this helper class here for the sake of reusability. So to make these two reusable instead of having that right there. Okay, and so now this entire section here looks like it is really centered on the page. Okay, and so with this, we could now say that we finished this section, but I just want to show you one more thing. So I want to add a nice hover effect here on these two cards. So that's something that we would not have to do, but yeah, I want to show you more and more things here. So let me just quickly show you how we can do that in just one line of CSS. So that's something that I think we have never done before, which is to use hover on something that is not a link. But we can, of course, perfectly do that. So we have meal, which is the entire card, and then we can use the hover pseudo class on that one. So the effect that I want to implement here is that whenever we hover over this element, I want the entire element to move up a little bit. All right. So again, I'm sure you have seen this in action somewhere on the web. And so for this, for moving up, I like to use the transform property with the translate value. So we have used translate before, remember that, a couple of times. And so here we have to define two values where the first one is for horizontal movement and the second one is for a vertical movement. So for example, we can say to rem here, right? So again, horizontal, which is like X, and then the second is vertical, which is Y. So the X and Y axis. So of course, this will not be what we want, but you see that once we hover it, it does happen. So it does move 20 pixels down and to the right. Okay. However, I only want to move it up, so only in the Y direction. And so here actually we can use the translate Y property. And so then we only define the Y property, so the vertical one, right? So that is a bit better already. So just in one direction, but I want it to go up. So that's -2. Okay, but that's also a little bit too much because this effect should be something very subtle. And of course, also there should be an animation, right? So 1.2 rem here, and now the animation. Now, how do you think we can do that animation? Well, once again, that's very simple. all we have to do is to use the transition property on the original state. So that's this one. So transition all, and now let's go a bit higher. So the bigger the element, the longer we can animate it. So let's now use 0.4 seconds this time. Okay, nice. That looks quite nice actually. Great. And now, just as a very final touch, let's also manipulate the shadow here a little bit to make this effect look a bit more realistic. So by moving up the element, we kind of simulate it moving closer to the source of the light, right? And so therefore, the shadow can then become a bit larger. So let's do that. And I will just copy this here. So right here. And so we will make it larger. So let's move one step up here to 3.2 RAM and here to 64. So to 6.4 RAM. And then we should also make it a bit lighter. So a shadow that is more diffused and bigger, basically, also naturally should be lighter. And again, these things, you will learn them with practice. Right. All right. So that's very subtle, actually. But if you notice, then the shadow does change a little bit. And this makes it more natural indeed. Okay. And so, yeah, that's it for this section. Once again, very beautiful, very nice looking, I think. And our page is really coming together here. So we have this beautiful section. This one here is very gorgeous as well. And of course, also our header. So I hope you're having a lot of fun here, that you're starting to become really proud of what you're building here. And yeah, once you're ready, observing this beautiful project, then let's move together to our next section, because there is still a long way to go. Welcome back to our next project section, which is the very exciting testimonial section. And here, remember, we had already decided in the very beginning of the project that we were going to put the customers and the photo gallery side by side. So what we're going to do here is a very different section this time, which is going to go all the way from the left side to the right side of the browser. So not having a centered container, but instead filling up basically the entire available width. And so that is what we call a full bleed section. So again, we will have the gallery on the right side, and on the left side, we will have this 2x2 grid of customer testimonials, just like in this first design example that we have here on the right side. Okay, so this is going to be really exciting because it's going to be quite different from the other sections. And so let's get to work. All right. And as always, let's add a new section right after the previous one. And I'm calling this one, as you can guess, the section testimonials. All right. And now, as I just said before, here we are not going to use a container. So that container element that we created before to center the context in the page. So instead, we will basically have two boxes, one for the testimonials and one for the gallery. So let's do that here. So let's write that just here. And then another one for the gallery. All right. And so these two, we want them to be side by side, right? And so what we can do here is to use our grid class right here on this section, right? So grid and grid, two columns. So let's just quickly check that out. And I need to reload the browser here manually. So sometimes that is necessary. And indeed, now here we have the testimonials all the way to the left side and the gallery all the way to the right side. Great. So let's add some padding here to this section for now to give ourselves some more space. And then we will simply start by filling up the content for the testimonials. So I will again copy this. And then section like this. Okay. So let's actually reach into our content file and get the testimonials from there. So yeah, right here. So this is the first one here from 𝗦𝗬𝗜𝗖𝗬. So let's paste that here. And now we need to mark this up. So we want a customer photo. We then want this text here in another element. And then below that is the name. So 𝗦𝗬𝗜𝗖𝗬 here. And so we need some kind of container element for all of this, right? Now we could of course use a simple div element, but here actually there is another element which makes a bit more sense, which is the figure element. And I'm not sure if we have used the figure element before, but in any way, we can use it to represent some self-contained content, and which sometimes has a caption. So this is perfect for things like diagrams or photos or code listings, or really anything that can have a caption and that is self-contained. And a testimonial like the one we are about to write here, I think qualifies quite nicely for that. So you will see the figure element being used for this kind of thing all the time. Okay. So let's call this one the testimonial. And then, well, first let's start with the image, actually. So image, then it's probably in the customers folder. And there we have actually a named photo for each of them. So this is Dave, and so the photo is probably dave.jpg, right? And now for the actual testimonial content, we can use the block quote element. So block quote, as the name says, is basically for representing quotes. So things that someone else said. And so a testimonial is exactly that. And the same is true for something like a product review, or even to quote someone in the context of an article or a blog post, for example. So block quote is perfect in this case. Let's call it the testimonial text. And then put that right there. Here we forgot the class right here. So testimonial image and also the alt text. Let's say photo of customer 𝗦𝗬𝗜𝗖𝗬. Okay, and now we just need to mark up the name here. And for that, we can use a simple paragraph or a span element. So that doesn't really matter. I'm just going to use a paragraph here. So testimonial name, let's say. And then let's add his name right there. And then it's also common to like add a dash in front of the name. So for that, we can use just another HTML entity. And this one is called m dash. So if we hover over that, you see there it is. So instead of just using this, which wouldn't look so great, the m dash is exactly what we're looking for. So checking that out, here we go. So the image is always a bit too big, but this time it's not so bad. So we can actually, I think, start adding the rest of the content here before having to adjust the CSS first. So let's copy all of this and put them all one after another. So we have 4 testimonials, so 4 code blocks here. And the next one is, need to go back. Let's copy all this, and I will immediately paste it actually into this block quote element. And then we just remove the name here. Also here, and then here we go. So let's see. Indeed, now the second one is great. And now let's just replace the third and the fourth one. And so this part of filling up the content is always a bit boring. But well, the content is the most important thing, so we have to do it, of course. So here and here. And just one last time. And just replacing the name here one last time. Okay, great. So let's check that out. And there we go. So now what we want to do next is to put these 4 here into a 2x2 grid, right? So that's easy. So let's do that. And for that, we need to select this testimonials, which is basically the parent of these 4. And so we will make this one here our grid container. Now, you might think that we could use, of course, the reusable grid that we created before. And indeed, we could, but probably the spacing on that one is not ideal. So the gap that we used there, which makes sense for bigger layouts, is probably too big for a smaller component like this one. And so here we simply create our own new grid. So basically that reusable grid that we created is more for the overall page layout. All right. So grid, template columns, 1FR and 1FR. And then let's create some smaller gap. So maybe 4.8 rem. That's always a good value to start with. And let's also make the image immediately a bit smaller. So testimonial image. And now this image, we actually don't want it to be flexible. So let me show you what would happen if we did. So setting a width of 100% would make it probably way too big. Right? So that's not what we're looking for. Indeed, it is nicely fluid like this. But again, yeah, these images here, we want them to be a fixed width. So let's say instead 64 pixels. And since these images are squared, the height will then automatically be figured out by the browser. We also want to make them round. And again, since they are squared already, we can just use border radius 50%. Okay, nice. That's starting to look a lot better. Now, there is no spacing here yet on the side here, but we will fix that a little bit later. So for now, let's just take care here of the visual styling just of this text here. So very quickly, we want the testimonial text and the testimonial name. So here we're going to use our common 1.8 rem again. So this is the one that we have been using all the time for all kinds of contents, and so it's nice to keep it consistent, and the same for the line height as well. So again, using 1.8 rem here. Or actually, of course, not rem, just 1.8, because this is basically a multiplier. So this will multiply the font size here by 1.8, and that will then be the line height. Remember that? And then let's also add some margin here to the bottom. And here we will not have a lot of space, so let's keep it small at 16 pixels. And of course, we also need some space below the image. So margin bottom 1.2. So that's the previous step in our spacing system. And then here the name. And here, as for visual hierarchy, this one is a lot less important. So let's make it smaller. Let's say 1.6 rem. And let's also make it even lighter. Now the main text is 555 and the darker text is 333, right? And so let's try for this one here 777. And we will actually change this here in a minute because of the color contrast ratio. But for now, let's go with this. So let's check it out. And beautiful. That looks really cool. Now let's actually just add the section heading here. And that heading, we will actually do it right here inside of the testimonials container. So here before these testimonials, we will have our usual subheading and secondary heading. So let's go back and we can again copy that from the previous section. So just this here. Right here. And so as I just said before, we want these headings to be basically before these testimonials here. Right? So just like this, but then we don't want them to be centered and we don't want them to be inside of a container. So actually we don't need any of this here. Right? But now we actually do have another problem. And let me illustrate that to you. And so here you can see it. So now remember how we made this entire section a grid container, right? And so now the subheading and the secondary heading here, they simply became grid items as well, right? But that's not what we want. We want them to be basically inside of this left side here of this section. So what we're going to do is to wrap all of this here into another new container element. And with container, I don't mean the container class that we created, but instead, I mean like a parent element. So let's call this the testimonials container. And then let's put the closing tag here after all of this. So right here in the end, but of course, before the gallery. Okay. So here we need to, of course, also change the text. So, well, here we actually didn't get any title. So the subheading is quite simple. It's simply going to be testimonials. But then here we need to come up with another heading. And so the one that I decided to use here is kind of a catchy one, saying once you try it, you can't go back, which is basically the overall message that these 4 testimonials here give to the user. Okay, so let's check it out. And now it is fixed. So just to see here in the inspector, now this one here is a grid container, right? And it contains both the testimonials container and the gallery on the other side, right? And then inside of the testimonials, we have then again another grid, which is for these 4 individual testimonial figures here. Okay, great. So that's great progress already. And so now in the next lecture, we will start building the gallery here on the right side. Let's continue building our testimonial section by now adding the gallery. So here we already have the element with the class of gallery. And so this is where now we are going to add our 12 images. And so also the gallery will then of course be our grid container, right? Now here I could of course now simply put all these 12 images one after another, but I actually will want to build a very nice hover effect on these images. And so for that, I will need each of them to be inside of a container element. And for that, I will use again the figure with the class of gallery item. So not 𝗤𝗜𝗖𝗬, but more like this. And now let's add the image here. So img, and then reach into the gallery folder, and then here gallery 1. And the alt text is, and here I'm actually just going to write a generic alt text instead of describing each of the images perfectly. So I will just write photo of beautifully arranged food, because this is what all these images here are all about. Here, forgetting to close the element. Yeah, that's it. So the figure element is really the perfect container element for images. So many times when you see, for example, in a blog post images, then usually they also have some kind of caption. And for that, we can use the fig caption element and then write something basically below it. Something like this. All right. Now in this case, we actually don't want any caption. We simply want to display the image inside of this container. And again, the reason for that is a really cool hover effect, as I'm going to show you in a minute. So I will turn this off here, just so you know that we can also use the fig caption element inside of the figure element. So we cannot use this one outside. It is only allowed to be used inside of figure. Okay. But anyway, let's copy that here. Let's remove this, and now just gallery 2. And you see here, it is now a different image. And yeah, so just an image inside of a figure. And so now let's just copy this a couple of times. So not even counting here. If it's too much, we just delete the remaining ones. So 3, 4, 6. So we're halfway through because it's 12 images. 8, 9, 10. And we're just missing one. Pasting that here again. And number 12. And there we go. So that's the HTML of our gallery. Very simple. But here, of course, it is going to look crazy. And it does. So, of course, we need to make them a lot smaller. And notice these small space here between the images. That is actually because the images are inline elements by default. And so if we made them a block element, then this would disappear. And this is something important that you need to know, because sometimes we get these annoying white spaces around images, And then this is how you fix that. So gallery item, and then I didn't add a class here to these images, so I'm simply using the descendant selector here. And so to fix that space, all we have to do is to set them to a block level element. And so now you see that the spacing is gone. Okay. But now, of course, what we will want to do is to actually create our grid. So that's right here on the gallery element. So gallery, and once again, here we are creating like our own new grid instead of using the predefined one. So display grid, and then grid template columns. And we want 3 equal sized columns. So 3 times 1 FR. All right, but still that will not fix the problem, because now the images are still huge and they no longer even fit our page. All right, and so of course the solution here is to make these images here flexible. So simply giving them a width of 100%. And so that should fix it, and it did. Nice. That's starting to look like something already. Let's just add some small spacing between the images, so not to have them glued together like that. And a very small gap here should be enough, like just 16 pixels. Something like this. And then let's go back. And that looks beautiful. Okay, so the gallery itself is actually already done, right? And so let's think now about this entire section, because there is still a lot of stuff that we need to fix here. So first of all, to make this section here stand out a little bit more, especially because we have these two content blocks here side by side, we should now give this section here a different background color. So you see that we have these 3 sections which all have the white background color, and the first one here, so the hero, has this very light orange tone. And so I think we should now finally go back to having a section with that orange tone as well, to make it stand out a little bit more from the rest and to create some nice visual contrast here between the sections. So let's do that. And I think it is this one here. Right. So that looks already a lot nicer, I think, at least. But now there's still something strange going on, because it would be a lot nicer if the spacing, for example, here at the top would be exactly the same as is here between these images. And also here at the right side. So the gallery is glued right now here to the side of the browser, and it would be nice to basically also have the exact same spacing that is here inside of the gallery around it. So that would make it look a bit more natural. And so what we need to do is to basically remove this huge padding from the section and instead put it inside of this container right here. So having this big padding only inside of this left side. Okay. So I'm going to remove that from here and put it in the testimonials. And actually we will want it basically around the entire thing. So not just top and bottom, because with this, we will then finally also create some space around it. And actually that was the wrong element. So let's go back. Ah, yeah. So it should, of course, be here in the testimonials container. So not just around the grid container, but really inside this entire thing. So including the headings. Right? And yeah, so that is what I was going for. So with this, we have the exact same spacing here as we had in the other sections and also below it. And also we have the same spacing here on the left side. So that looks perfect like this. But now let's think about the spacing that I was talking about earlier. So basically adding this spacing around the gallery that is also inside of it. So that shouldn't be too hard. We can simply add some padding also inside the gallery. So padding 1.6 rem, and so again the exact same spacing as we have here, right? And that is exactly what I was talking about. So that looks really cool, I think. And it's nicely integrated now, basically into this section. Now we just have some problems here, I would say. For example, that here the text is quite narrow and it is breaking here into these 5 lines in this one and in this one, while here at the top we only have 4 lines. So all in all, it is looking a bit narrow, and I think even the spacing between these two is not enough. So the spacing here, I think, between the rows is good, but it's many times the case that for the columns we need some more spacing. So let's actually increase that before we do the other thing that I was talking about. So the row gap is good already. But now let's add a lot more column gap. So many times it doesn't look so natural to have the same gap in the row and in the column. And so the column many times needs a lot more. So that looks a lot better in terms of spacing, but then we made the problem even worse of the content here being too narrow. So there are 2 things that we need to fix here. First of all, there is too much space between the gallery and the testimonials here. And let me show you that in the inspector. So the inspector, once again, is really an invaluable tool here. So what I mean here is that, of course, around the testimonials container, we have our padding of 9.6, right? And so that's basically the space that we would want between these testimonials and the gallery. However, here inside this grid, we also have this spacing, right? And so this space we actually do not want here. So instead of using this predefined grid here, so our big layout grid, we will actually once again create our own grid. So for this reason that we can remove then the gap here, but there's also a second reason which I will talk about next. So that is the second thing that I mentioned earlier. So I said the first thing is that the spacing here is too much, which is because we're adding the padding plus the column gap. But then the second problem is that I think that actually this gallery here is a bit too wide. So right now, of course, these columns have the same size, but we should fix that. Okay, but first, let's do that first thing. So removing this predefined grid from here and creating our own grid for the section testimonials. So that's here. And so display grid. And then grid template columns. And for now, I will again make them equally sized, just so we can see that first problem being fixed. Okay. And so now you see that the only spacing that we have here is basically coming from this padding, and then also that 1.6 rem of padding that is coming here from the gallery. But I would say that we can neglect that one, right? So this is a bit better now, but still we have these two here in 5 lines of text and not just 4, which would make them look a lot better like here. Also, this content here is very dense. It's like a big wall of a lot of colorful and big content. And so if you take a look at this, it kind of looks as though this right side here would be a lot bigger than the left side, right? It has a huge visual impact And so I think we can fix that a little bit simply by making this gallery a little bit more narrow. And so that will then, of course, free up some space here for this left side, and will also visually make it look a lot more balanced. Okay. Now, here, of course, we don't want to make huge changes. So, for example, we don't want this column to be twice as wide as the other one. That would be way too much, right? So, like this, it also doesn't look good. So one trick that I like to use when I'm using FRs here is to use them as though they were percentages. So remember that these two values here, they actually don't need to be 1 in order for the columns to have the same size. They simply need to be the same number. So we could also say 50 and 50, right? So that would then look exactly the same as before. And so now this looks a little bit like percentages, where this one is like 50% and this one is another 50%. Just remember that we do not use percentages here because then we wouldn't take care of the gap. Now here we don't have a gap, but anyway, we always should use FR. Now the point of this is that now we can say that this one should be like 55% and this one just 45. And so with this, we still have 100, and so the width is the same as before, but it is now going to be a bit more balanced. So you see that? So this is, I think, a lot better. And again, of course, these two together do not need to be 100. We just do it like this, so we can think of this in terms of percentages. So that's just a nice trick that I like to use myself. Okay? Now, if we check this out, this will create a problem. Well, actually not right now, but let's see that we make this a bit smaller. Then we would get all this weird spacing here between these rows, right? And we do not want that, of course. And so here in our grid, let's define align items set to center. And so that will, or at least it should, fix that problem. Right. Now, of course, the spacing here is gone, like that uniform spacing that we had with this 1.6 rem at the top as well. And so this is not ideal, but we will fix this a little bit later with media queries. Okay, for now, on this screen size here at least, I think it looks really, really nice. Now, just a small detail that I mentioned before is the color of this text here. So remember that it is 777 on now this background color. And so the contrast ratio might not be great at this point. So let's actually check that here in the contrast checker. And so, yeah, well, we're actually using this one, but still it is poor. So it should be above 4.5. And so what I'm going to do now is to basically drag this here as low as it can before it becomes yellow, basically, right? So yellow means that it is at least 4.5, which means it is acceptable. So this gray color here is basically the last one that we can use safely on this background color. So let me copy it and use this one instead. Okay. So VS Code then converted it to the lowercase f's. And let me actually paste then this color here in our design decisions. And I'm going to say lightest gray allowed on this one. All right. So let's go back. And yeah, nice. So it looks almost the same as before, but it is still significantly lighter than this one creating this nice visual hierarchy between this more important content and then this one. All right, and with this, we are almost finished with this section. So we could actually say we are finished, but remember how I said that I wanted to show you a nice hover effect here on these images. And so let me now show you what I'm talking about. So basically what I want to do is that whenever we hover over one of these images, that they'll scale up so that they become a little bit larger. So that's quite simple. So we will again select these images, and then we will define the hover state on the images. So basically what happens as we hover over the images. So here again we use the transform property, which remember has all kinds of different options. So we have used all the time the translates functions here, but there are other things that we can do. For example, we could rotate them. So let's try that, like 45 degrees. So DEG stands for degrees, and so that's yet another unit that we can use in CSS. So of course this is not what we're going for, but we could do this. So now the images rotate. And sometimes if you're building something like a more creative layout, then this might actually be a nice effect to go for. But in this case, what I want to do is really to scale. And I think we already did this before at some point. Let's try 1.1. Okay, like this. But now, of course, let's make it smooth. And so remember that all we have to do in order to do that is to add the transition property on the original element. So transition all, so which I'm always using, because then if later I add some other things here to the hover effect, then I can be sure that it is covered here in the transition property already. And let's again use our longer animation time, so the same time that we used also in the cards. And this could actually be another design decision that we could put here in general, so animation times. But well, let's not overcomplicate things. And so now the animation is nice and smooth, but still there is something missing because, well, it works perfectly, but it doesn't look really, really nice like this. So I think it does look a bit weird and a bit off. And so now that's where this container element comes into place. So the element into which we wrapped each of the images. So remember that down here, each of the images is inside of a figure, right? And so now as we scale up the images, they will basically overflow their parent element, right? And we can see that here in the inspector. So if we keep this one selected, well, cannot really see that, but if we turn on the grid, then it should become visible. And yeah, so basically each of these squares here is one of the figure elements. And so now as we hover, the image actually overflows that figure, right? And so what we can do to prevent that, remember, is to simply set overflow to hidden. And so that is the missing part of this trick and of this cool effect. So gallery item overflow hidden. And let's remove this, or actually don't yet. And so you see that now it does no longer overflow the figure because we fixed that with once again overflow hidden, which is a really important property that we need all the time. All right. And so now the images look as though they were the exact same size as before, but they scale in a little bit. So they kind of look as though they move towards the user as we hover them. And so this is something that I really like. And it is just another cool trick that we can do using the power of CSS. Nice. So very, very beautiful section here, I think. And I'm pretty sure that you also really like it. So that's just putting all the design guidelines that we used before into practice together with the power of CSS to achieve it.